My son told me it was just paperwork. He said it didn't change anything. He said I'd still be taken care of. I believed him. So I opened the safe and I signed. I wasn't going to talk about this. For months, I told myself it was finished, that I'd made my peace with it, that retirement was supposed to feel like this. Quiet, uninterrupted, nobody needing anything from me anymore. But peace doesn't arrive just because you decide it should. I'm 72 now. I live alone in the same house I've lived in for 40 years, the one my husband and I bought when we thought the store might actually work. It did work. For a long time, it worked better than we ever imagined. And then he died, and I kept it working. That part I was proud of. The truth is, I didn't retire. Not really. Retirement suggests you had a choice in the timing, that you looked at your life and said, "This is enough. I'm ready to stop now." That's not what happened. I don't go to the store anymore. I'm not supposed to. That was the agreement, though nobody called it that. I didn't know then that one line in those papers would decide who I was allowed to be. At the time, I truly thought I was doing the right thing. Most mornings, I sit with coffee and look out at the street. The neighbors wave, I wave back. Everything looks normal. I think that's what bothers me most, how normal it all looks from the outside. People ask how retirement feels. Restful, I say. Silence counts as agreement. What happened was a Tuesday afternoon in May. I remember because it was warm and we'd just gotten a shipment of patio furniture that needed to be unloaded. Daniel called and asked if I could come to the office after closing. He said Claire would be there too. I thought it was about inventory, or the website they'd been talking about for months. It wasn't. They had documents, the kind with signatures at the bottom and language I'd seen before, years ago, when my husband and I first set everything up. Legal language. Transfer language. "Mom," Daniel said, "we think it's time." The room was very quiet. Claire already had a pen. I didn't ask what they meant. I already knew. They wanted the store. Not just to run it. They'd been doing that for a while anyway. They wanted it to belong to them. Officially. Completely. "You've earned a rest," Claire said. Her voice was kind. I remember that clearly. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't even impatient. Just resolved. Like the decision had already been made, and this conversation was a formality. "You'll still be part of everything," Daniel added, but the way he said it made me understand I wouldn't be. I looked at the documents. I didn't read them. I knew what they said. I'd signed papers like these before, when we bought the building, when we incorporated, when my husband's name had to come off everything after the funeral. This felt the same, except it didn't. "Do I need to do this now?" I asked. It wasn't defiance. I wasn't angry. I was just trying to understand the urgency. Claire nodded. "Now is best." I picked up the pen. My hand hesitated for a second, but nobody said anything. Nobody stopped me. So I signed. The strange part is I didn't feel much of anything in that moment. No anger, no grief, just a kind of hollow recognition, like watching something fall and knowing you can't catch it anymore. They thanked me. We went back out to the front of the store, where someone had brought cake. There were balloons, a few of the regular customers had stopped by. Helen was there, smiling, but she didn't quite meet my eyes. Everyone said it was wonderful that I could finally relax. I nodded. I ate cake. I went home. A week later, the paperwork went through. The store belonged to Daniel and Claire, and I became someone nobody asked anymore. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Family dinners still happened. I still sat at the same table. But when they talked about the store, and they always talked about the store, they didn't look at me. Not for opinions, not for confirmation, not even for stories about how things used to be. It was like I'd become background. Claire would mention a new vendor, and Daniel would nod, and they'd discuss pricing, logistics, marketing. I'd sit there with my hands in my lap, waiting for a natural place to add something. The moment never came. "Retirement suits you," someone said once. I think it was Claire. I smiled. The word retirement is always poorly explained. People use it like it means freedom, like it means you've won something, but nobody tells you what you've lost in the process. I started noticing small things. The way Daniel's phone would buzz during dinner and he'd glance at it with a look I didn't recognize. Stress, maybe, or something close to panic. The way Claire's voice changed when she talked about the store's future. Confident, controlled, like she'd been planning this for longer than I realized. The way Helen, my employee of 30 years, started hesitating before she spoke to me. And then, a few weeks after the transfer, Helen called. "Could you stop by?" she asked. Her voice was careful. "Is something wrong?" "No, I wanted to ask you something." We met in the back storage area. The lights buzzed when she turned them on, the same way they always had. "That day," she said slowly, "when you signed everything, did you go through all the documents?" "Of course," I said. Too quickly. Helen closed a box she'd been holding. "That's good," she said. "That's a relief." But her face didn't look relieved. I didn't ask what she meant. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I went home, I made dinner, I sat in front of the television without watching it, and I thought about that word, relief. Helen's voice stayed with me longer than it should have. That's a relief. I kept turning it over in my mind, the way you do with something that doesn't fit quite right. Relief is what you feel when a worry resolves, but Helen hadn't looked resolved. She'd looked like someone who'd decided not to say something. I tried to let it go. I tried to settle into what everyone kept calling my new life. Mornings without alarm clocks, afternoons without inventory counts, evenings without the sound of the register closing. It should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt like waiting. The first few weeks were the hardest. I'd wake up at 5:30 out of habit, already running through the day's tasks in my head before I remembered I didn't have tasks anymore. Someone else was opening the store. Someone else was checking the shipments. Someone else was making the decisions I'd made for 40 years. I told myself this was natural, an adjustment period, that I'd find a rhythm eventually. But rhythm requires purpose, and I couldn't figure out what mine was supposed to be now. I started taking walks, long ones, past the store. I'd tell myself I was just stretching my legs, getting exercise, but I always slowed down when I reached that block. The window displays looked different. Claire had rearranged everything. More modern, she'd said. More curated. I didn't argue. Daniel called once a week. "Checking in," he said, making sure I was settling in okay. "How's the store?" I'd ask. "Good. Really good, actually." He never offered details. I stopped asking. Family dinners continued. Sunday evenings, rotating between their house and mine. The routine hadn't changed, but something else had. I'd sit at the table and they'd talk around me, past me, like I was a piece of furniture they'd grown accustomed to. One Sunday, Claire mentioned they were meeting with the bank. "Just routine stuff," she said when she caught me looking at her. Daniel nodded, cutting into his chicken with more focus than it required. "Paperwork," he added. I wanted to ask what kind of paperwork, what kind of routine, but the way they'd both answered so quickly in that practiced way made me feel like I'd already asked too much. So I smiled. I cleared plates. I pretended not to notice the glance they exchanged when they thought I wasn't looking. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand why everything felt wrong. The transfer had been clean, legal. Nobody had forced my hand. I'd signed willingly, or at least I'd signed without protest, which amounts to the same thing in the eyes of the law. But something had shifted in the weeks since, and I couldn't name it. It wasn't until the following Tuesday that I understood. I'd gone to the grocery store, the one near the shop, and ran into Thomas Reed. He'd been handling the store's banking for years, one of those steady, reliable men who remembers everyone's name and never rushes a conversation. "Maggie," he said, smiling, "how's retirement treating you?" "Fine," I said, quiet. He nodded, but something in his expression changed, a hesitation. "I heard about the transfer," he said carefully. "Big change. It was time." "I'm sure." He paused, shifting his weight. "Daniel and Claire seem very focused on the next steps." The way he said focused made my chest tighten. "What kind of steps?" Thomas looked uncomfortable. "I probably shouldn't say. Client confidentiality and all that." "Of course." But he didn't walk away immediately. He stood there, holding his shopping basket, looking like a man caught between rules and conscience. "Maggie," he said, finally, "you did review everything before you signed, didn't you? All the documents?" It was the second time someone had asked me that. "Yes," I said. Thomas studied my face for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "That's good." But just like Helen, he didn't look like he believed me. I drove home with my hands tight on the wheel. That evening, I called Daniel. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course, Mom." "What's happening with the store? Really happening?" A pause. Too long. "Nothing's happening. We're just running it, like we talked about." "Thomas mentioned you've been meeting with the bank." Another pause. "Just standard business stuff, refinancing options. Nothing you need to worry about." Nothing you need to worry about. That phrase, I'd heard it so many times in the past few weeks, from Daniel, from Claire, even from Helen in her way. It was meant to sound reassuring. It didn't. "Daniel," I said quietly, "I'm not worried. I just want to know what's going on." "Mom," his voice shifted, took on that patient tone people use with the elderly. "You signed the store over so you wouldn't have to deal with this stuff anymore. That was the whole point, to give you peace." I know what the point was. "Then trust us. We're taking care of everything." He said goodbye before I could respond. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after that. Trust us. But trust only works when both people know the same things. The next morning, I drove to the store. I didn't plan to. I told myself I was just going downtown, maybe stopping at the coffee shop. But my car turned onto Main Street, and then I was parking in front of the building I'd unlocked every morning for 4 decades. Helen was inside, restocking a shelf near the window. She saw me through the glass. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she came to the door and opened it. "Maggie?" I just wanted to see how things were going. She glanced over her shoulder, then stepped outside, letting the door close behind her. "They're not here," she said. "Daniel and Claire. They won't be in until this afternoon." "I wasn't looking for them." Helen's mouth tightened. "What did you come for, then?" I didn't have an answer. Or maybe I did, and I wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. "That question you asked me, about the documents." Helen waited. "Why did you ask me that?" She looked down at her hands. She'd worked for me for 30 years. I'd never seen her this uncertain. "Because," she said slowly, "there were more documents in that safe than what you took out that day." My heart stuttered. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Helen said, meeting my eyes finally, "I think there's something they didn't show you." I didn't go back into the store that day. Helen's words hung in the air between us, and I knew if I stepped through that door, everything would change. Not the facts, those had already changed, but my understanding of them. And once you understand something, you can't unknow it. I wasn't ready yet. "I should go," I said. Helen nodded. She looked almost relieved. I drove home and sat in my kitchen for hours, staring at nothing. There's something they didn't show you. The sentence kept circling back, each time with a different weight. Had they hidden something deliberately, or had I simply failed to ask the right questions? And which possibility was worse, that they'd deceived me, or that I'd been so easy to deceive? I made tea I didn't drink. I opened a book I didn't read, and I tried to remember exactly what had happened that day in May. The office, the documents spread across the table, Claire with the pen already in her hand, like she'd known I'd sign. Daniel's voice, gentle but final. "You've earned a rest." But what had been in those papers? I'd glanced at them, seen the legal language, the signature lines, the official formatting. Transfer of ownership. I'd signed papers like them before. I knew what they meant. Or I thought I did.
That night, I dreamed about the safe. It was an old one, installed when we first bought the building. Heavy steel, combination lock, the kind of thing that made you feel secure just looking at it. My husband had insisted on it, said we needed to keep the important things protected. After he died, I was the only one who knew the combination. Until I taught it to Daniel. I woke up at 4 a.m. with my heart racing. For 3 days, I did nothing. I went through the motions, made coffee, took walks, smiled at neighbors, but my mind was somewhere else, running through possibilities, trying to construct what I didn't know from the pieces I had. On the 4th day, I called Helen. "Can you meet me?" I asked. "When?" "Now." We met at a diner 2 towns over, neutral ground, somewhere Daniel and Claire would never think to look. Helen was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. I slid into the seat across from her. "Tell me what you know," I said. She hesitated. "Helen, please." "She don't know anything for certain," she said finally, "but I've worked in that store for 30 years. I know what's usually in that safe." And that day, after you left, I saw Claire putting documents back, more than what you'd taken out. Maybe they were different documents, new ones. Maybe. Helen's voice was flat. But then why did she close the safe so quickly when she saw me watching? I felt something cold settle in my chest. "What do you think was in there?" "I don't know, but Maggie," she leaned forward, "they've been stressed. Daniel especially. I've heard phone calls, arguments almost, about money. The store's always had tight margins. This is different. This is urgent." I sat back, processing. "You think they're in trouble?" "I think they needed that store for something more than just running it." The coffee in front of me had gone cold. I wrapped my hands around the cup anyway, needing something to hold on to. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" Helen looked away. "Because I wasn't sure, and because you seemed so ready to let it go. I thought maybe I was wrong, that I was seeing problems that weren't there." "But you don't think you were wrong?" "No," she said quietly. "I don't." I drove home carefully, both hands on the wheel, my mind working through logistics. The safe, the combination, the documents Helen had seen. I needed to know what was in there. But I couldn't just walk into the store and demand access. Legally, it wasn't mine anymore. I had no right to that safe, no claim to its contents. Except I knew the building better than anyone. I knew which floorboards creaked, which windows didn't lock properly, where we kept the spare key to the back entrance hidden under a loose brick near the dumpster. I knew these things because I'd been the one to notice them, to use them, to remember them when everyone else forgot. That knowledge was mine, and no transfer of ownership could take it away. 2 days later, I went back. It was early evening after closing. The street was quiet, most shops already dark. I parked 2 blocks away and walked,
my heart beating harder than it should have. The spare key was still there. I stood at the back door for a long moment, key in hand, feeling the weight of what I was about to do. This wasn't my store anymore. This was, technically, breaking in. But it had been my store for 40 years, and I needed to know. The door opened silently. I'd oiled those hinges myself just a few months ago. Inside, everything was dark, except for the emergency exit signs casting a faint green glow. The smell hit me first. Paper, wood polish, the particular mustiness of old inventory. Home. This place had been home longer than my house had. I moved through the darkness without needing light, past the front displays Claire had rearranged, through the narrow hallway to the back office. The door was unlocked. The safe sat in the corner, exactly where it had always been. I knelt in front of it, my knees protesting, and reached for the dial. My fingers remembered the combination before my mind did. Right, left, right. The sequence I'd performed thousands of times. The lock clicked. I pulled the door open. Inside, folders and envelopes were stacked neatly, more organized than I'd ever kept them. Claire's doing, probably. I started pulling them out one by one, looking for something that didn't fit, something they wouldn't have shown me. Tax documents, insurance papers, lease agreements. All familiar, all expected. And then, at the very bottom, tucked under a folder labeled Archive, I found it. A single document, newer than the others, printed on different paper. I lifted it out carefully. The header read, "Secured line of credit, collateral agreement." My hands started shaking. I read the first paragraph, then the second, and then I understood why Thomas had looked so uncomfortable, why Helen had asked about the documents, why Daniel had sounded strained every time I called. They hadn't just taken ownership of the store. They'd already pledged it as collateral for a loan, a substantial one, and according to the date on the document, they'd started the process 2 weeks before asking me to sign. I sat on the floor of the office, the paper in my lap, and felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet. Something colder. Clarity. I'd thought I was signing over a store, but what I'd really signed away was my right to know what they were doing with it. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it. The loan document went to the bottom of the stack, the folders returned to their precise positions, the safe door closed with the same solid click it had always made. Then I locked the back door behind me and walked to my car. I didn't cry, I didn't call anyone, I just drove home and sat in my living room until the sun came up. The clarity from the night before had settled into something harder to name, not quite anger, not quite betrayal, something more like recognition, the way you feel when you finally see the shape of something that's been there all along. They'd needed money, they'd used the store to get it, and they'd made sure I didn't know until after I couldn't object. The question now was why? What kind of trouble required that much urgency, that much deception? I thought about calling Daniel, confronting him directly, but I knew how that conversation would go. He'd tell me not to worry, that everything was under control, that I'd misunderstood something, taken something out of context. He'd make me feel foolish for looking. So I didn't call. Instead, I started paying attention. At the next Sunday dinner, I watched them differently. Not as my son and daughter-in-law, but as people with something to hide. Daniel was thinner, the kind of thin that comes from stress, not intention. He checked his phone constantly, even at the table. Each time it buzzed, his jaw tightened. Claire maintained her composure better, but I caught her watching him when she thought no one was looking, calculating, assessing. "How's the store doing?" I asked, keeping my voice light. "Great," Claire said smoothly. "We're actually up 15% from last quarter." "That's wonderful." "The online expansion is really paying off," Daniel added. They were good at this, the performance, the reassurance. I smiled and passed the potatoes. Later, while clearing dishes, I heard them talking in the kitchen. Their voices were low, but the house had thin walls. "We need to decide soon," Claire was saying. "I know," Daniel sounded exhausted. "But if we do that, there's no going back. There's already no going back. The payment's due in 6 weeks." A pause. "What if we can't?" "We will. We have to." I stayed very still in the hallway, a stack of plates in my hands. "Does she know?" Daniel asked quietly. "No, and she doesn't need to." "Helen might have said something." "Helen doesn't know the details. Nobody does, except us and the bank." I walked into the kitchen before they could say more. They both turned, smiles already in place. "Let me help with those," Claire said, reaching for the plates. Her hands were steady. Her face was calm. If I hadn't heard that conversation, I would never have known anything was wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep again. 6 weeks, a payment due, money they apparently didn't have. The store was collateral, which meant if they couldn't pay, they'd lose it. And if they lost it, what would that mean for me? I'd signed away ownership, but my name was still connected to that business. My reputation, my legacy, everything I'd built. I got out of bed and went to my desk. In the bottom drawer, I still had copies of some old store documents, bank statements from years ago, incorporation papers. Nothing current, but enough to remind me how things used to work. I spread them out on the kitchen table and started reading. By morning, I had a plan. It wasn't revenge. I didn't want to hurt them, but I needed to understand the full picture, not the sanitized version they were feeding me, but the truth. And to get the truth, I needed help from someone who wouldn't lie to me. I called Thomas Reed at the bank. "Maggie," he said, surprised. "How are you?" "I need to talk to you about the store." A pause. "I'm not sure I can discuss." "I know about the loan," I said quietly. The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. "You should come in," he said finally. His office was small and neat, everything in its place. He closed the door after I entered and gestured to a chair. "How much do you know?" he asked. Enough to know I was kept in the dark. Thomas sat down heavily. He looked older than I remembered, or maybe just tired. "I shouldn't be talking to you about this. Client confidentiality. The store was mine for 40 years. Doesn't that count for something?" "It was yours," he said gently. "Past tense. Legally, I can't share details of another party's financial arrangements." I'd expected this, but I'd also known Thomas for 2 decades. I'd helped his daughter find her first job. I'd extended store credit to his family when he'd lost his own job years back, before the bank hired him. He owed me nothing legally, but memory creates its own obligations. "I'm not asking you to break rules," I said. "I'm asking you to help me understand what's happening to something I built, something I thought I was protecting by stepping aside." Thomas rubbed his face. "They're in over their heads," he said finally. "The loan was supposed to be for expansion, online infrastructure, inventory. But Daniel had personal debts I don't think Claire knew about initially. The money got redistributed." "How much?" "More than the store can cover through normal operations." "How much time do they have?" 6 weeks until the first major payment. If they miss it, the bank has the right to call the full loan, which means they lose the store." He nodded. I sat with that information, feeling it settle. "Is there anything I can do?" "You're not on the loan documents. You're not liable. Legally, this isn't your problem anymore." "That's not what I asked." Thomas looked at me for a long moment. "There might be something," he said slowly, "but I need to check some things first.
Can you come back tomorrow?" I agreed and left, my mind churning.
That evening, Daniel called. "Mom, I wanted to ask you something." My chest tightened. "What is it?" "Claire and I have been talking. We think it might be good for you to have a little distance from the store. You know, fully embrace retirement. Stop coming by. Stop asking Helen about daily operations. Just let go completely." The words were gentle, but the message was clear. They knew I'd been asking questions, and they wanted me to stop. "I've barely been by," I said carefully. "I know. I just mean, for your own peace of mind, it might be easier if you think of the store as separate from you now. A new chapter, for all of us." "Is something wrong, Daniel?" "No, everything's fine. I just want to make sure you're taking care of yourself." After we hung up, I sat with the phone in my lap. They were closing ranks, tightening control, trying to push me further out before I could see too much. But they'd made one miscalculation. I'd already seen enough. And now I knew I wasn't the only one who'd noticed something wrong. Thomas had noticed. Helen had noticed, which meant there might be others, people who remembered what the store used to be, what it used to mean, people who might help me understand what it had become. The next morning, I went back to Thomas's office. He was waiting with a folder. "I found something," he said. "It's not much, but it might matter." He opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was old, yellowed at the edges, a document I'd forgotten existed. My husband's will. "Look at clause 17, Thomas said. I read it, then read it again. It was a provision about the store, language about succession and control. My husband had been careful with his words, had built in protections I'd never thought to use, protections that, depending on how they were interpreted, might still apply. "This doesn't give me ownership," I said slowly. "No," Thomas agreed, "but it might give you standing, the right to information, to challenge certain decisions if they threaten the business's core purpose. Would that hold up? I don't know, but it's something they don't know you have." I looked at the document, at my husband's signature at the bottom, at the date from 30 years ago. He'd tried to protect me. Even then, he'd known I might need protecting. I left the bank with the paper folded in my purse, feeling the weight of it. For the first time since that day in May, I had something they didn't expect. Not power exactly, but leverage. I kept the document in my purse for 3 days before I did anything with it. Not because I didn't know what it meant, I did. Thomas had been clear enough about that. But knowing you have leverage and understanding how to use it are different things entirely. And I'd never been someone who wielded power carelessly. During those 3 days, I lived my life as though nothing had changed. I watered my plants, I returned library books, I smiled at checkout clerks and made small talk about the weather. But underneath, something was shifting. I'd spent weeks feeling displaced, removed, like furniture someone had decided to rearrange. Now I felt something else. Alert. On the 4th day, I made copies of the document. One set I locked in my own safe deposit box at a different bank. One set I kept at home. The original stayed in my purse. Then I called Helen. "I need to know exactly what you've seen," I said. "Everything. Not just about the loan." We met at the same diner. This time, Helen brought a small notebook. "I started writing things down," she said, sliding it across the table. "After you came by that first time. I thought maybe I was imagining things, but then I started paying closer attention." I opened the notebook. Her handwriting was careful, precise. Dates, times, observations. March 15th. Claire on phone with someone about restructuring timeline. March 22nd. Daniel left early, looked upset. Heard him say, "We can't wait that long." April 3rd. New insurance policy paperwork on desk. Coverage amount doubled. April 18th. Claire meeting with real estate agent. Overheard market assessment and potential buyers. My hands tightened on the notebook. Buyers? I only heard part of it, Helen said, but that's what it sounded like. They're thinking of selling. Or they already have someone interested. I don't know which. I read through the rest of the entries. Small observations, fragments of conversations. None of it definitive on its own, but together they painted a picture I hadn't wanted to see. This wasn't just about a loan they couldn't repay. They were planning an exit, and they'd made sure I was already gone before they started. "Thank you for this," I said, quietly. Helen looked at her hands. "I should have told you sooner, before you signed. You didn't know what it meant then." "Neither did you." "No," I thought. "I didn't. But I did now."
That Sunday, I went to dinner at their house as usual. Claire had made roast chicken, Daniel opened wine. Everything looked normal, felt normal, except now I could see the cracks. The way Daniel poured his wine too quickly and drank it faster. The way Claire's smile never quite reached her eyes. The phone that sat face down on the table between them, waiting for something. "How's everything going?" I asked midway through the meal. "Good," Daniel said automatically. "Busy," Claire added. "Lots of changes happening." "What kind of changes?" A glance passed between them. "Just improvements," Daniel said. "Updating systems, making things more efficient." "Sounds expensive." "It's an investment," Claire said smoothly. "Short-term costs for long-term stability." I nodded and took a bite of chicken. "I ran into Thomas Reed the other day," I said casually, "at the bank." Daniel's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "Oh?" "He mentioned you'd been meeting with him about financing." The silence lasted 3 seconds too long. "Just routine business discussions," Claire said. "Nothing unusual." He seemed concerned. "Thomas worries too much," Daniel said, his voice tight. "It's his job to be cautious, but we know what we're doing." I wanted to ask more, to push, to lay the document on the table and watch their faces change, but I didn't, because I'd learned something in the past few weeks. Information is only powerful if people don't know you have it. "I'm sure you do," I said instead. After dinner, while Claire was in the kitchen, Daniel walked me to my car. "Mom, about Thomas. What about him? Whatever he said, I want you to know it's not as dramatic as it might have sounded. We're handling things." "I'm sure you are." "And I meant what I said before about distance. I think it would be better for everyone if you let us manage the store without—" He stopped himself. "Without what?" "Without second-guessing every decision. We're adults. We've got this." The streetlight cast shadows across his face, making him look older. Or maybe he actually was older. Maybe the stress of whatever they were hiding had aged him in ways I hadn't noticed. "Daniel," I said quietly, "I'm not trying to interfere. You know, but sometimes just asking questions feels like interference, like you don't trust us. Do you want me to trust you?" He looked startled by the question. "Of course. Then stop lying to me." The words came out before I could stop them. Daniel's face went very still. "I'm not lying. You're not telling me the truth. That's the same thing. Daniel," my voice was sharper than I intended, "I'm not the enemy here. Then why does it feel like you're investigating us? Because you've been treating me like someone who doesn't have a right to ask questions about something I built." He looked away, jaw working. "We were trying to protect you," he said finally. "From the stress, from the worry. You've dealt with enough. That wasn't your choice to make. You signed the store over. That made it our choice." The words hung in the air between us.
He wasn't wrong exactly. Legally, he had every right to manage the store without my input. I'd given up that right when I'd signed those documents. But there was something else, something he didn't know about yet. "Good night, Daniel," I said. I drove home with my hands steady on the wheel, my mind already working through the next steps. The following morning, I called a lawyer, not our family lawyer, the one who'd handled the transfer, someone new, someone who didn't have loyalty to Daniel and Claire already built in. Her name was Patricia Walsh. She came recommended by Thomas, who'd called her thorough and discreet. I met her in her office downtown. "I need to understand something," I said, sliding my husband's will across her desk. "Clause 17, what it means, what it allows me to do." Patricia read it carefully, then read it again. "This is interesting," she said finally. "Good interesting or bad interesting?" "Potentially very good, assuming you want to challenge some decisions that have been made. I'm not sure what I want yet. I just need to know what's possible." She spent the next 20 minutes explaining the provision's implications. Legal terms I barely understood, but whose weight I could feel. My husband had specified that the store's core mission, serving the local community, maintaining its character as a family business, had to be preserved by any successor. And if someone challenged whether those conditions were being met, the original founder had standing to request a review. Would it hold up in court? I asked. Possibly. It's unusual language, and it was written a long time ago, so there's some ambiguity. But ambiguity can work in your favor if you're strategic about how you use it. "I don't want to sue my son." Then don't think of it as suing. Think of it as establishing your right to be informed, to have a voice in major decisions that affect the business's fundamental nature. I sat with that. If I wanted to use this, what would be the first step? A letter, formal but not threatening, notifying them that you're aware of Clause 17 and requesting full disclosure of any decisions that might impact the store's core mission, including potential sales, major financial restructuring, changes in ownership structure. And if they refuse, then we consider next steps. But most people respond to these letters, especially when they realize someone has legal standing they didn't know about. I thanked her and left with a draft letter in my bag. That night, I read it over and over. It was only 2 pages, professional, calm, but it would change everything. Once I sent it, there would be no pretending anymore, no pleasant Sunday dinners, no comfortable fiction that we were all fine. But maybe we weren't fine. Maybe we hadn't been fine for a while, and I'd just been too tired to notice. I thought about my husband, about how carefully he'd written that provision, how he must have known, even then, that protection might be needed. He'd trusted me to use it if necessary. The question was whether necessary had arrived. I put the letter on my kitchen table and stared at it until morning, and then I signed it. I mailed the letter on a Tuesday morning. The postal worker took it from my hands, stamped it, and dropped it in the bin behind her. I watched it disappear and felt something close to nausea. There was no taking it back now. Patricia had advised me to wait 3 business days before expecting a response. Give them time to process, she'd said, and to consult their own attorney. I spent those 3 days in a state I can only describe as suspended. I couldn't eat properly, couldn't focus on television or books. Every time the phone rang, my heart jumped. But the call, when it came, wasn't from Daniel. It was from Claire. "We need to talk," she said. Her voice was controlled, but I could hear the anger underneath it. "All right?" "Not over the phone. Can you come to the store? Tonight after closing?" "I can do that." She hung up without saying goodbye. I arrived at 6:30. The lights were still on inside. Through the window, I could see Daniel pacing near the back office. Claire stood perfectly still, arms crossed, watching him. When I knocked, Claire came to unlock the door. She didn't greet me, just stepped aside to let me in, then locked the door behind us. Daniel stopped pacing when he saw me. His face was drawn, exhausted. "What is this?" he said, holding up a copy of my letter. "What are you doing?" "I'm exercising a right I didn't know I had." "A right to what? To interfere? To threaten us?" "I'm not threatening anyone. I'm asking for information." "You're asking for control," Claire said coldly. "That's what this is about. You can't stand that we're running things now." "I can stand it just fine. What I can't stand is being lied to." "We haven't lied," Daniel said. "You've hidden things. That's close enough." Claire's expression hardened. "You signed over the store. You gave up the right to know every detail of how we operate it." "Maybe, but according to my husband's will, I didn't give up the right to ensure it's being operated in line with its original purpose. Its purpose is to stay in business, which is what we're trying to do. By using it as collateral for a loan you can't repay? By talking to potential buyers?" Daniel's face went pale. "How did you—" "It doesn't matter how I know. What matters is that you've been making decisions that could destroy what I spent 40 years building, and you thought you could do it without me ever finding out." "We were going to tell you," Daniel said, but his voice lacked conviction. "When? After the sale went through? After the bank took possession?" Silence. Claire spoke first. "We're in a difficult position." "I know you are. I've known for weeks." "Then why didn't you say something sooner? Why go through lawyers?" "Because every time I asked a question, you told me not to worry. You treated me like someone who couldn't handle the truth." "We were trying to protect you," he said again. "I didn't need protection. I needed honesty." Claire's jaw tightened. "The situation is more complicated than you understand." "Then explain it to me." Another silence, longer this time. Finally, Daniel spoke. "I made some bad investments," he said quietly, "a few years ago. I thought I could recover the losses before anyone noticed, but they got worse. And then there were business expenses that didn't pan out. The online expansion cost more than we projected. We were hemorrhaging money." "So you took out a loan?" "We had to. It was the only way to keep everything afloat." "Using the store as collateral?" "It was that or shut down completely." I looked at them both, my son who looked 10 years older than he should, and my daughter-in-law whose composure was finally starting to crack. "How much do you owe?" Daniel glanced at Claire. $340,000, she said. The number hit me like a physical blow. "And the payment that's due in 6 weeks?" $85,000. "Do you have it?" "We're working on it." "That's not an answer." "No," Claire said flatly. "We don't have it." The store felt very quiet suddenly, just the three of us and the weight of that number. "What happens if you can't pay?" I asked, though I already knew. "The bank calls the loan, we lose the store, and depending on how much they can recover from the sale, Daniel might still be personally liable for the difference." "Because of your investments." Daniel nodded, not meeting my eyes. "Why didn't you come to me before any of this? Why didn't you tell me you were struggling?" "Because you'd already given us so much. The store, the inventory, the contacts, everything. I couldn't ask you for more. I couldn't admit I was failing at the one thing you trusted me to do." His voice cracked on the last word. I felt something shift inside me, not forgiveness exactly, but recognition. He'd been protecting his pride the same way I'd been protecting mine. We'd both ended up here in this locked store after hours because neither of us knew how to ask for help.
The potential buyers Helen heard you talking to, are they still interested? Claire hesitated, then nodded. A regional chain. They'd keep the location, probably keep some of the staff, but they'd rebrand it, change everything. And they'd pay enough to cover the loan? Most of it, not all. When were you planning to tell me about this? After it was done, Claire said. It seemed kinder that way. Kinder to whom? She didn't answer. I walked to the window and looked out at the street. The same street I'd looked at for 40 years. The same storefronts, though some of the names had changed. The same parking meters. The same view that had been mine before it wasn't. That provision in the will, I said, not turning around, it gives me standing to challenge a sale if I believe it violates the store's core purpose, serving the community, maintaining its character as a family business. We know, our lawyer explained it. He also said it would be expensive to fight, that the language is old and ambiguous, that we might win, but it would take months, maybe years. I turned back to face them. And by then, the store would be gone anyway. The bank wouldn't wait. So what are you asking for? Daniel said. What do you want? That was the question, wasn't it? What did I want? A week ago, I would have said justice, truth, recognition that I'd been wronged. But standing here now, looking at my son's exhausted face and my daughter-in-law's barely contained desperation, I realized those things wouldn't help anyone. I want to understand the full picture, I said. All the numbers, all the options, everything you know. Why? Because maybe there's something you're not seeing, or maybe I can help, or maybe I can't, and at least I'll know I tried. Claire's expression was skeptical. You're 72 years old. What do you think you can do that we haven't already thought of? The question should have stung. It didn't. I ran that store for 40 years, through recessions and family emergencies and every kind of crisis you can imagine. I might not know about online sales or social media marketing, but I know how to survive.
Daniel and Claire exchanged a look. If we show you everything, Daniel said slowly, what happens to the letter, to the legal challenge? That depends on what you show me and whether you're willing to let me actually help instead of just pretending to listen while you do what you were going to do anyway. Another silence. I need to think about this, Claire said. You have 45 days before that payment is due. Think fast. I walked to the door and waited for Claire to unlock it. As I stepped outside, Daniel called after me. Mom? I turned. I'm sorry, he said, for all of it, for not telling you, for making you feel like you didn't matter anymore. I wanted to say it was all right. I wanted to say I understood, but neither of those things was quite true yet. Let me see the numbers, I said instead. Then we'll figure out what comes next. I drove home with my hands shaking slightly on the wheel. The conversation had gone differently than I had expected. I'd thought there would be more anger, more defensiveness, more reasons why I couldn't possibly help. Instead, there was just exhaustion and fear, and the kind of desperation that makes people finally tell the truth. At home, I made tea and sat at my kitchen table with a notepad. $340,000, $85,000 due in 6 weeks. A store being sold to a chain that would strip away everything that made it meaningful, and a son who'd been too proud to ask for help until it was almost too late. I drew lines and numbers, trying to see patterns, trying to find solutions in math because emotions were too complicated right now. But the numbers didn't cooperate. No matter how I arranged them, I couldn't see a way forward that didn't involve loss. The question was what kind of loss we could live with, and whether there was any scenario where we all survived this intact. My phone rang at 10:30. It was Daniel. Tomorrow, he said. Can you come tomorrow? I'll show you everything. I'll be there. And Mom, Claire doesn't think you can help, but I do. I think maybe you're the only one who can.
After he hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time. Tomorrow I would see the full extent of the damage. Tomorrow I would understand exactly how close they were to losing everything. And tomorrow I would have to decide whether the information I'd fought so hard to access was something I actually wanted to know. Daniel was waiting when I arrived the next morning. The store hadn't opened yet. Helen was in the back restocking shelves, but she gave me a small nod when I walked past. She knew why I was here. Daniel had set up everything in the office. Laptop open, spreadsheets printed out, a stack of bank statements held down by a coffee mug. Claire wasn't there. She had a meeting, Daniel said, but the way he said it made me think she'd chosen not to be here, that this was something she couldn't watch. "All right," I said, sitting down. "Show me." For the next 2 hours, he walked me through it all. The initial loan, taken out 3 years ago when his personal investments had started failing. The second loan, 18 months later when the first one wasn't enough. The interest rates that had seemed manageable at first but had compounded into something impossible. The store's actual revenue versus what he'd projected, the gap growing wider each quarter. The cost of the online expansion that was supposed to save them but had only accelerated the bleeding. I listened without interrupting, made notes, asked questions only when the numbers didn't make sense. By the time he finished, I understood. They weren't just in trouble, they were drowning. "The buyers," I said, "how much are they offering?" $290,000. That leaves $50,000 still owed. "I know." "Where would that come from?" Daniel's hands were flat on the desk, like he was trying to hold himself steady. "We'd have to sell the house. Claire's parents might help with some. I have a retirement account I could liquidate, though there would be penalties." "And after all that, what would you have left?" He didn't answer, because the answer was nothing. They'd lose the store, the house, their savings. They'd start over with debt and no assets, and the kind of financial damage that takes decades to recover from, if they recovered at all. I looked at the spreadsheets again, at all those numbers Daniel had been carrying alone. "Why didn't the online expansion work?" I asked. "We were too late. The big retailers had already captured the market, and our inventory wasn't right for online sales. People shop differently on the internet. They want cheap and fast. We were offering quality and personal service. That doesn't translate digitally." "So you were competing on the wrong terms?" "Yes." I thought about that, about how the store had always worked, relationships, knowledge, trust, things you couldn't scale, things that didn't fit into algorithms. "What about the store itself?" I asked. "Not the business, the building." "It's on a 30-year lease, 15 years left." "And the equipment, inventory?" "Most of the inventory is pledged to the loan. The equipment is old, not worth much." I made more notes. "What if you didn't sell to the chain?" I asked. "Then we default. The bank takes possession. They'll sell it themselves, probably for less than the chain is offering. We'd still lose everything, but we'd owe even more." "What about reducing costs, cutting staff?" "Helen is the only full-time employee besides us. We can't cut more without closing." Every direction led to the same place: loss. I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes. For 40 years, I'd kept this store alive. Through my husband's death, through recessions, through big box stores opening nearby, and online retailers making everything cheaper and faster. I'd survived because I'd been willing to change when necessary, to adapt, to find angles no one else saw. But I'd also survived because I'd known when to hold firm, when to protect what mattered, even if it cost something. The question now was whether there was anything left to protect, or if we were just choosing between different kinds of ending. "I need to see something," I said, opening my eyes. "What?"
The original incorporation documents, the lease agreement, the store's insurance policies. Daniel looked confused but started pulling files. I spread them out on the desk and began reading. Contracts I'd signed decades ago, language I'd forgotten, provisions that made sense in 1985 but might mean something different now. And then I found it. Buried in the lease agreement, a clause about succession and transfer, language that gave the original leaseholder certain rights in the event of... I stopped. Read it again. "Daniel," I said slowly, "did Claire's lawyer read this?" "I don't know. Why?" I pointed to the clause. He leaned forward, scanning the text. His face changed. "I don't understand. What does this mean?" "It means," I said carefully, "that if the store changes hands through financial default rather than voluntary sale, the original leaseholder has the right to reacquire the business at assessed value." "But you're not the leaseholder anymore. We are." "No, look at the signature page. The lease was never formally transferred. It's still in my name." Daniel's hands started shaking. "But that means..." "It means if the bank takes possession and tries to sell, I could potentially step in, buy it back at whatever value they assess, which would likely be less than what the chain is offering, since it would be a distress sale." "But you don't have that kind of money." "No," I said, "I don't." The hope that had flashed across his face disappeared. "So it doesn't matter." "Maybe not. But it's information, and information changes negotiating position."
I gathered the documents and stood up. "Where are you going?" "To talk to Thomas, and then to talk to Patricia. I need to understand exactly what this clause allows." "Mom, even if you could somehow buy back the store, you'd be taking on all the debt, all the risk. Why would you do that?" I looked at him, my son, who'd tried so hard to prove himself that he'd nearly destroyed everything. "Because maybe there's a way through this that doesn't require you to lose everything," I said, "and because I'm tired of watching from the outside." I spent the rest of that day in meetings. Thomas helped me understand the bank's position. Patricia explained the legal implications of the lease clause. I called 2 other financial advisors whose names Thomas gave me. By evening, I had a framework. Not a solution exactly, but the outline of a possibility. It would require risk, and money I didn't have, and cooperation from people who had no reason to cooperate. But it was something. I went home and made a list of phone calls I needed to make, people I'd done business with over the years, contacts who might remember favors, relationships that had been dormant but not dead. At 9 o'clock, Claire called. "Daniel told me what you found." "Did he tell you what I'm thinking?" "He told me you're considering something insane." I waited. "You can't save this, Maggie. It's too broken. The best thing, the only thing, is to take the chain's offer and walk away with something rather than nothing." "Is that what you want, to walk away?" A long pause. "I want Daniel to stop drowning," she said finally. "I want him to sleep through the night. I want to stop calculating whether we can afford groceries." Her voice cracked on the last word. "I know you think I'm cold," she continued, "that I manipulated this whole situation. Maybe I did, but I did it because watching him suffer was unbearable." "I don't think you're cold," I said quietly. "I think you've been carrying too much alone." "So have you." "Yes." Another silence.
"What you're proposing," Claire said, "even if it's possible, it would put all the risk on you. You could lose your house, your savings, everything." "I know." "Then why would you do it?" I thought about how to answer that. "Because I'm 72 years old," I said finally, "and I've spent the last few months feeling irrelevant, like my time was over, like nothing I knew mattered anymore." That's not... Let me finish. What I realized is that I'd stopped fighting. I'd accepted that being done was the same as being finished, but it's not. And maybe I can't save the store. Maybe this whole plan is foolish and impossible.
But at least I'll know I tried, that I didn't just disappear quietly when things got hard. Claire was quiet for a long time. Daniel thinks you can do this, she said. He has more faith in you than I do, but then again, he's always needed to believe in something. And you? I believe in numbers, and the numbers say this won't work. Then I guess we'll see who's right. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table with my list of phone calls. Tomorrow I would start making them, asking for help, calling in 40 years' worth of goodwill and hoping it was enough. Tonight, I let myself feel the weight of what I was about to attempt. It was reckless, possibly stupid, the kind of thing someone my age wasn't supposed to do. But I'd been careful my whole life. I'd been responsible and steady and all the things that keep a business running for 4 decades. And where had careful gotten me? Watching from the outside while everything I'd built fell apart. Maybe it was time to be reckless. Maybe it was time to remember that I'd started that store with nothing but belief and stubbornness. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough one more time.
I looked at my list again. 12 names. 12 conversations that would determine whether this was possible or merely desperate. 12 chances to discover whether I still had the power to choose what happened next, or whether I'd already used up all my choices years ago. The first phone call was the hardest. His name was Robert Chen, and I'd sold furniture to his family for 30 years. When his restaurant had flooded in 2008, I extended him credit for 6 months without interest. When his daughter got married, I helped him find tables and chairs at cost. "Maggie," he said when he answered, "it's been too long." "It has. Robert, I need to ask you something." I explained the situation, not all of it, just enough. The store, the debt, the possibility of saving it if I could put together enough backing. "How much are you asking for?" I told him. A pause. "That's not a small amount." "I know, and I understand if you can't." He didn't say I couldn't, I said it's not small. "Give me 2 days." He called back in 1. "I'm in," he said. "Not for the full amount, but I can do 20,000. And I talked to Marcus Freeman at the hardware store. He said he'd match whatever I put in." I had to sit down. "Robert, you helped my family when we needed it. That doesn't get forgotten." By the end of the week, I had 6 commitments. Not enough to cover everything, but enough to show the bank I was serious. Thomas arranged a meeting with the loan committee. I wore the same suit I'd worn to my husband's funeral. Navy blue, practical, the kind of outfit that says you understand how serious things are. There were 4 people on the committee. Thomas was there, but he couldn't advocate for me directly. Conflict of interest, he'd explained, but he could present the facts. I presented my proposal. Restructure the loan, extend the timeline, lower the monthly payments. In exchange, I would take over primary responsibility for the debt, using my house as additional collateral and the commitments from local business owners as proof of community support. They asked questions for 45 minutes about my age, my health, my ability to manage a business at this stage of life. I answered each one directly. Yes, I was 72. No, that didn't mean I was incapable. I'd run this store through worse crises than this, and I wasn't planning to run it forever, just long enough to stabilize it and transition it properly. "And your son?" one of them asked. "Where does he fit in this new structure?" "He stays involved, but the final decisions come through me." "Why should we believe this will work when the current arrangement has failed?" I looked at each of them. "Because I'm not trying to expand into something we're not. I'm not trying to compete with Amazon or become a chain. I'm trying to be what we've always been, a place this community trusts. That's not scalable. It's not flashy, but it's sustainable." They said they'd discuss it and let me know. I drove home not knowing if I'd convinced them or simply revealed how desperate I was. 3 days later, Thomas called. He approved it, he said, with conditions. The conditions were strict: monthly financial reviews, quarterly assessments,
Any missed payment would trigger immediate default, but it was a chance. I called Daniel. They agreed? His voice was hoarse. They agreed. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything yet. We still have to make this work.
That night, I met with Daniel and Claire at the store. Claire had brought her own documents, spreadsheets, projections, a list of changes she thought were necessary. We went through them one by one. Some made sense, some didn't. We argued. We compromised. We found a middle ground that none of us loved, but all of us could accept. "This is going to be hard," Claire said finally. "Yes. You're risking everything." "Yes. What if we fail anyway?" "Then we fail," I said, "but at least we'll fail together instead of in pieces." Daniel's eyes were wet. "I'm sorry, Mom, for all of it, for not being strong enough to ask for help, for making you clean up my mess." "You're asking now," I said. "That's what matters." The next 6 weeks were the hardest I'd ever worked. Helen came back full-time at a reduced pay she insisted on. "I'm not losing this place without a fight," she'd said. We cut inventory to essentials, focused on what actually sold rather than what we thought should sell. I called every customer whose phone number I still had, personally inviting them back. Some came, some didn't, but enough came that we started seeing progress. Small progress, fragile progress, but progress. The first payment came due on a Tuesday. I wrote the check myself, my hand steadier than I expected. Daniel delivered it to the bank. When he came back, his face was lighter than I'd seen it in months. "They accepted it," he said. "Of course they did. It was the right amount." "No, I mean, they said the committee was impressed with the turnaround, with the community support." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak.
That Sunday, we had dinner at my house. All of us. Daniel, Claire, Helen, even Thomas, who'd become more friend than banker through all this. It wasn't a celebration. We weren't out of danger yet. Wouldn't be for years, probably. But it was something else. Recognition that we'd survived the worst of it, that we'd chosen to fight instead of surrender. After everyone left, I sat alone in my living room. I thought about that day in May, the office, the documents, the signature that had felt like an ending. It had been an ending, just not the one I'd thought. What had ended was my willingness to be invisible, to accept that my time was over, to believe that being careful meant staying quiet. What had begun was harder to name. Not a second chance, exactly, more like a reclaimed one. The store was still mine in a way it hadn't been before, not because of ownership, the legal structure was complicated now, shared responsibility, Daniel and Claire still involved in daily operations, but because I'd fought for it, because I'd refused to let it disappear without me. A week later, I went to the store early before anyone else arrived. I opened the safe, still remembered the combination, and took out the documents, the ones I'd signed in May, the ones that had started everything. I looked at my signature, that small, neat version of my name that had felt like surrender. Now it just looked like handwriting. I put the documents back and closed the safe. Then I walked to the front of the store and unlocked the door. The morning light came through the windows, illuminating dust particles in the air, the same light that had been coming through these windows for 40 years. Helen arrived a few minutes later. "You're here early," she said. "Couldn't sleep. Thinking about everything?" Something like that. She set her bag down behind the counter. "It's going to work, you know, what you're doing, what we're all doing. Maybe. No maybe about it. I've worked here long enough to know when something has fight left in it." She looked around the store. "This place has fight. Because you're still here. Because we're all still here." Daniel arrived at 8. Then Claire. We had a brief meeting about the day's priorities. Nothing dramatic, just the ordinary work of keeping a business running. But ordinary felt different now. It felt chosen. That afternoon, a young couple came in looking for a dining table. "We just bought our first house," the woman said. "We want something that will last." I showed them what we had, explained the wood types, the construction, the differences in quality. They asked questions, I answered them. When they decided on a table, solid oak, the kind that would outlast them, the woman smiled. "My grandmother used to shop here," she said. "She always said this was the only place in town that didn't try to sell you something you didn't need. Your grandmother had good sense." She did. She also said the owner was someone you could trust. I paused. "I'm the owner," I said. "Still?" "Still." The woman's smile widened. Then she was right. After they left, I stood at the counter for a moment, feeling the weight of that word. Still. Not again, not returned, not restored. Still. As if I'd never really left, as if all the months of displacement had been a detour rather than a destination. That evening, I locked up the store and stood on the sidewalk outside. The street was quieter now, most shops closed for the day. A few people walked past, heading home. I looked at the building, at the sign that still bore the name my husband and I had chosen 4 decades ago. It wasn't perfect. The paint needed touching up. The windows could use cleaning. But it was standing. We were standing. I got in my car and drove home. At my desk, I took out the documents Patricia had prepared, the legal framework for the restructured agreement, my signature at the bottom of each page. But these signatures felt different from the ones in May. These weren't surrender, they were negotiation, terms I'd insisted on, protections I demanded. My name in ink stating clearly that I was still someone who chose. I filed the documents away and made tea.
Tomorrow there would be more work, more payments, more struggles to keep everything balanced. But tonight, I allowed myself something I hadn't felt in months. Not peace, exactly, but the possibility of it. The understanding that endings and beginnings aren't always opposites, that sometimes they're the same moment, just viewed from different angles. I'd thought retirement meant stepping aside, becoming smaller, letting go. What I'd learned was that letting go and disappearing aren't the same thing. You can release control without releasing yourself. You can trust others without trusting them with everything. You can be 72 years old and still have fight left, still have choices, still have worth. I sat in my living room as the light faded, thinking about all the things I'd almost lost. The store, my dignity, my sense of purpose. But I hadn't lost them. I'd reclaimed them, not through anger or revenge or proving anyone wrong, through the simple, stubborn act of refusing to be finished when everyone, including myself, had decided I was. And that, I realized, was its own kind of victory. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that simply continues. Still here, still choosing, still me.